So the reading I chose today is the Good Samaritan. You've heard it many, many times, but perhaps you don't know the full context of its importance. So let me give you a little bit of historical background. In the year 933 BCE, the 12 tribes of Israel fractured. There was a civil war, and the 10 northern tribes seceded from the 2 southern tribes. So thereafter, the 10 northern tribes are known as Israel, and the 2 southern tribes are Judah and Benjamin, and they were at war with each other. But in the year 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire attacked the northern kingdom of Israel and demolished it and wiped out the 10 northern tribes. They're taken into exile and they're never heard of again. The southern tribes survived for another 130 years. And then in the year 598 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, which in the interim had overcome the Assyrian Empire, captured Jerusalem, and deported the last 2 tribes. And then they destroyed the temple, the first temple, one that Solomon had built about 950 BCE. So the last 2 tribes are taken into exile. But there were a few kind of sharecroppers left, farmers who were left in the land, not taken into exile. And these people eventually intermarried with the Babylonian colonialists, and their progeny are called the Samaritans. So in the year 539 BCE, when the 2 last tribes of Israel are set free, the Persian Empire, in the meantime, has overcome the Babylonians and set the last 2 tribes free to go back into the land of Israel. And now they go back and they're meeting these half-breeds. They're crossed between their own people who remained and the colonialists, and there's tremendous animosity between them. And so when the Samaritans offer to help rebuild the temple, the Judeans refuse completely. So there's tremendous animosity between them. And now fast forward another 500 years, and Jesus is telling this story. So now you have the context for it. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You've answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." These are words inspired by God. So for the month of March, I decided to do a deep dive into the notion of a personal cosmology. Really important that each one of us have our own personal cosmology that explains life to us. And I've suggested many times that as you attempt to build a personal cosmology, the skeleton of it will be the answer to 4 questions. Who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? And so last week I began this, and I did an introduction to the whole topic of personal cosmology, and I looked at the God question, who God is and who God is not. And so today I want to continue with that search. I want to talk then today about the other 3 questions. Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? So let's have a look at the notion of when we talk about I or me, to whom are we referring? Now, most of us are actually identifying with the very bottom of the descent from God all the way down to the ego by the 7 bodies that Hinduism talks about. And so ultimately there is source or God. And then this God spins off net, so it seems, sparks of the divine, holographic fractals of the self. And these we call souls. That would be level 2 in the descent. And then below that, as we become denser, we begin to identify with our psychic body, the ability of clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, telepathy, psychokinesis, etc. And then we come down to a lower level and we begin to identify with our mental body, with our thoughts. We think we are our thoughts. And then we go even denser and we begin to identify with our emotions, our astral body. And then we come down further and we begin to identify with our energy system, with the etheric body. And then finally, we begin to identify with our physical self, with these space suits. Now, that's where we're operating from. And it's from there we begin the descent or the evolutionary process again. So in order to understand this, we need then to understand how do we make our reality? Of what does reality making consist? And I would suggest that it consists of the following stages, as we're stuck in these space suits of ours. And the first one is that we're reliant upon our sensorium, our eyes and ears, etc., to kind of deliver reality to us. But all of these faculties or senses have very, very limited ranges. So I remember listening to a talk one time that really startled me. The guy who was speaking said, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. And I think, what? Are you trying to tell me that 1 billion years ago, grass wasn't green and the sky wasn't blue? And he continued, yes, 1 billion years ago, there was no color on planet Earth. Because 1 billion years ago, the eye had not yet been invented. So there was nothing that could infer color from the electromagnetic spectrum. The eye was created by a tiny little creature called the trilobite about 545 million years ago. But before the trilobite, there were no eyes on the planet. So there was no way to infer color from the electromagnetic spectrum. So we start off with our sensorium, realizing that it is very, very limited. Every one of them is limited. And then from these kind of the images that our senses deliver to us, whether they're acoustical images, or olfactory images, or visual images, from these we create our perceptions. Our perception then will be the second stage. That's how the brain interprets the incoming data. The only problem is the incoming data is actually using Boolean algebra, binary mathematics, and wave theory. And now the brain is converting Boolean mathematics and wavelength into visual images or whatever. So we're massaging the data for the experience. So now we start with senses, then the perceptions massage the data, and then that leads to what we call our experience. So the experience is what happens once the data from the sensorium have been processed by the brain. Now, after we've generated an experience, if I were to use a kind of a metaphor to distinguish between senses, perception, and experience, using kind of cooking, I would say that the senses are the ingredients that you collect. The perception is the cooking process. You put them into the pot and you boil them. And then the experience is the taste of the food. And so that's how you know how it moves. Now, after the experience has been established, then we build up memory banks. And the memory banks lead to a sense of self. And finally, our sense of self leads to a reality model. So let's look at memory then. And so what is memory? Memory is a kind of a mixture of actual experiences you've had, but movies you've seen, readings you've done, and your expectations. So your memory is far from reliable. It's not just bringing back stuff that actually happened to you. You're mixing in movies you saw with it and readings you did and expectations you have, or fears you have, and then the memory comes out completely contaminated, but you think it to be real. And when you look at the kind of the neurology of the brain itself, there are two basic aspects of memory within the brain. The hippocampus is that little organ in the brain that records the facts, just the facts, man, give me the facts. And the amygdala is the part that attaches emotional associations to the facts. And so, for instance, let's say, God forbid, that I was coming from my office in Los Altos, and I had a car accident, and at the intersection, every time I would go down to that same intersection, if my hippocampus had been, damaged in the accident, I would have no memory of the facts, but I'd have an emotional reaction. Somehow that corner would upset me, and I don't know why it would upset me, because I've lost the facts, but the amygdala is working. On the other hand, if I had damaged my amygdala in that accident, but the hippocampus was fine, I'd be able to come to the intersection and say, oh yeah, this is where I had the accident and I was in the hospital for a month. But there'd be no emotional association. That's just a fact, just a fact. Now, the problem is when we retrieve memories, then we change it every time we retrieve it. So every time I go back into my memory bank and I retrieve a memory, it's like taking leftover food from the fridge. I take it out, I take it a bit more, I put it back in. Tomorrow, I take it back out, have some more, put it back in. So I keep taking leftover food in and out of the fridge. So the food is going to spoil. So the memory is spoiled. The more frequently I retrieve a memory, the more I spoil it. But it's caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. Because if you don't retrieve your memory occasionally, it's like an old photograph that you have in an album someplace. You've never taken it out. And when you take it out now, it's all faded. You can't see it properly anymore. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. So that's the kind of the trick that memory begins to play with us. And now on the basis of the sensorium and the perception, and the experience and the memories, you're now creating a sense of personal self. You now think that you know who you are. But this sense of self to which we kind of navigate incarnation is actually an illusion. And I have to share with you, for me, a kind of an upsetting incident that happened when my father was very, very elderly and he had dementia. And at one stage, he was a great walker. He went out for a walk. He came back to his house and there's a glass door on the front door. And he comes to his front door and there's another guy inside looking out at him. And my father gets really upset. He says, "Get out of my house." And the guy shouts back at him, "Get out of my house." And my father waves his fist at him and the guy inside waves his fist at my father. So my father picks up a big stone and smashes the glass. And the guy disappears. And of course, what happened was he was looking at his own image in the glass, but he didn't recognize it because at that stage, his sense of self had been radically compromised. Now, the truth is, even in the best of health, our sense of self is actually an illusion. It's created, by incarnation. And so many of the great thinkers believed that there was no such thing actually as a personal self, in the sense in which we typically imagine it. And so the Buddha talked about an atma, no self. And Confucius believed that our sense of self is predicated, on the collusion of 5 important relationships. The relationship between husband and wife, parents and child, elder brother and younger brother, teacher and student, and emperor and subject. And Confucius said, your sense of personal self is actually an illusion created just by these 5 special relationships you're in. So even when we get to a sense of personal self, often what we think to be me is not me. So then as you're building your cosmology and you're asking the question, who am I? What kind of an answer are you going to come up with? Because your senses are not going to do it for you. Your perception is not going to do it for you. Your experiences are kind of made up in some senses. Your memory bank is faulty, and therefore your sense of self is faulty. So what can you trust? So when I think about that myself, I go back to the great Hindu teaching that says, you have a body, but you're not your body. You have emotions, but you're not your emotions. You have an intellect, but you're not your intelligence. And I would add to that, you have a personality, but you're not even your personality. The personality is simply the interface between your real self and the environment in which it finds itself. And so it becomes very, very important then to be able to answer the question, who am I? When I say I, what do I mean? And my answer to that is, I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. I'm a soul on safari on planet Earth. I'm a bite-sized piece of guide. Yeah, I'm a holographic fractal of source. So anything less than that is going to get me into all kinds of trouble as I begin then to wrestle with the question of who is my neighbor and what is my mission. So that's my first point. How do you answer the question, who am I? Let me look then at the question of neighbor. When I say neighbor, what do I mean by neighbor? So let me start with the notion of brother as we find it in the scriptures. So it's not a good story as we start out. The very first, story practically in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 4, is a story of one brother killing another brother. Cain killing Abel. And then when God says, where's your brother? He says, am I my brother's keeper? He denies that he's done it. The next great story between brothers is the story of, so Abram had a son called Isaac, and Isaac had 12 kids. Isaac had 12 kids, one of whom was Jacob. And Jacob, there's two brothers, Isaac and Esau. And Esau is the firstborn, and Isaac is the secondborn. But Isaac steals Esau's birthright and cheats his own father. Yeah, so Isaac is blind at this stage. So Jacob fools his father Isaac and pretends that he's actually Esau and steals his brother's blessing with the connivance of Jacob's own mother, Rebecca. So there you have two brothers again once more. You've got Isaac, you got Jacob, and Isaac and Jacob cheating each other. Then you have the story a little bit later on of Joseph, who's sold into slavery by his own brothers. They throw him in a pit, pull him out, and then sell him to slave traders who bring him down to Egypt. So the notion of brother doesn't get off to a very, very healthy start, in the scriptures. But then it picks up a little bit, and you get, for instance, Peter and Andrew. Andrew is actually the first disciple of Jesus, and it is Andrew who introduces his brother Peter to Jesus. The second disciple of Jesus is John the Beloved. And John, introduces his brother James to Jesus. And in fact, when Jesus dies, James actually becomes the leader of the Jesus movement. This is James, the brother of Jesus himself. So here's a brother who takes over from Jesus. And there's James and John, two other brothers, finding Jesus and finding truth. So that's the notion of brotherhood. If you extend it then out to the notion of neighbor, typically the word neighbor has had, I would say, a very checkered history. Initially, neighbor just meant some kind of a special relationship and a space basically on geographical proximity, not on kind of quality of connection, but just geographical proximity. My neighbor is the guy who lives next door to me. But even a cursory perusal of history will tell you that most people who live beside each other were not very neighborly. Certainly different tribes are constantly making war on each other. So the idea of neighbor then is very, very fraught with difficulty. And so now you have Jesus being asked this question by the expert in the law, who is my neighbor? And he tells this very famous parable of the Good Samaritan. And I've explained the historical background to you so that you know that, a Jewish priest and a Jewish Levi saw a Jewish man lying half dead at the side of the road. They ignored him because it was verboten for a priest to touch a dead body. If he did, he couldn't enter the temple until he was purified. And the same with the Levite, who were kind of the sacristans in the temple. So they ignored the fellow Jew lying at the side of the road. And then comes the Samaritan, this accursed, half-caste, who married with the colonialist back 500 years before. He comes down and sees a Jew lying at the side of the road, picks him up, attends to him, and picks up the tab and the bill. Now, it's interesting then that this was a man who was on his way from Jerusalem down to Jericho. So there's another kind of part to this story. When Joshua entered the promised land in the year 1210 BCE and began the conquest of the promised land, it took them 200 years. It was 200 years from the time they entered by Jericho until they conquered Jerusalem. So they start in Jericho on a bloody campaign that ends with the capture of Jerusalem in the year 1010 BCE. Jesus starts his parable in Jerusalem and it ends up in Jericho. So he absolutely reverses the journey of Joshua in order to point out that the new kingdom, the new promised land, is a place of love and neighborliness. It is not about conquest. So this story of the Good Samaritan has many, many, many very interesting meanings. So when I think of neighbor, then what do I mean by neighbor? And for me, it means that basically there is only one body. There is only one life. Everything that exists basically is God in drag. Everything that exists is simply a holographic fractal of source itself. And if that be true, then it means that all sentient life forms are neighbor to me, whether they exist on this planet as different tribes or different cultures or even different species, or on other planets or in other dimensions. Anything which emanates from God is brother and sister to me. because we're all fractals of the same source. And so the very highest practice, then perhaps spiritual practice, is to learn to see God in everything. And I love that Hindu greeting then that says Namaste, which means the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you, because there is nothing which is not God. And therefore neighbor, literally means that, all of manifestation is neighbor to me. So that's what I mean then by the answer to the question, who is my neighbor? What about my mission then? What have I come here to do? I've told this story a few times before. In 1984, I was appointed to a little mission in Baringo in Kenya, a place called Kipsaraman, which literally means the place of the twins. And I was replacing a man called Father, whom I regarded as probably the greatest missionary priest I've ever met, an extraordinarily compassionate man in very practical ways. He was a farmer as well as being a priest, and he introduced, citrus fruits to the area and coffee so people could have a livelihood. And John was leaving this mission because he had volunteered to go to the southern Sudan to begin a brand new mission with a brand new language. And in actual fact, he was captured up there after a few months and marched for about 6 months by liberation troops who carried him all over the Sudan before they set him free. He survived it gratefully. But there was a big, big party for him in Kipsaraman before he left. And people from all over the area were coming, bringing him gifts of various kinds. And there was a microphone set up for the day. And I always remember this young Tugan woman with a baby at her breast, leaning over the table where John was seated, and didn't realize she was speaking right into the microphone. And she's speaking in the Tugan language. But what she said to John was, she thought she was whispering it, but the entire group could hear what she said. And what she said basically was, Father Gary, if you had breasts, I'd want my infant to suckle from you. She has such a regard for this extraordinarily compassionate man, that's what she would wish for her own baby. So at that mass as well, we sang this great song to him, Here I am, Lord, it is I, Lord, I've heard you calling the night, because that's what John heard, and wherever he was needed, that's where he went. Now, in some sense, every one of us is meant to be a John Gary. Every single one of us. Every single one of us said, yes, Lord, I heard you calling. I'm coming, because my heart is bursting with love for humanity. And we come down here, and then we have amnesia for who we are, and we either sleepwalk our way through incarnation, or we curse our luck for the situations in which we find ourselves. So most of us are asleep at the wheel, having said, yes, send me, I'll hold your people in my heart. We forget we even have a heart, that there is a God, or that there is a mission. So what precisely is the mission? When we begin to become aware of it, I believe that there are 2 levels to this mission. That the first level is to grow in love as an incarnated individual. That even though I'm incarnated and I'm subject to the vicissitude of incarnation, that I still remember who I really am. And that even in the course of incarnation, I can continue to grow as a human being. And the second part of the mission is that every one of us volunteered to be part of the team that shifts the world into Christ consciousness, that is self-realized, that begins to discover our Buddha nature, that's the second part of it. And we come equipped. Our spacesuits have equipment that we need in order to wake us up and fulfill that mission. And so especially we have physicality, that's one kind of tool in the tool bag. We have emotionality, and then we have intellectuality, and we have personality as well. Now, we're meant to use our physicality and our emotionality and our intellectuality in order to preach God to the world, not to get up in a butter box, but to do it by the quality of our living. Now, in psychological theory, there's this long debate between nature and nurture. People claiming, we're basically the product of nature. We're born the way we are and nothing can change us. The other people claiming, no, it's about nurture. We're basically born tabula rasa, we're empty slates, and you can write anything you want in it. So behavioral psychology thinks, you can train us in Skinner boxes and make anything you want out of us. So are we nature or are we nurture? I believe there are actually three components, not two, not just nature and nurture. There is nature, there is nurture, that comes in. And of the three pieces, the soul is by far the most important constituent in personality. Nature helps and nurture helps, but it's the soul that comes in that's hugely responsible for the personality that emerges. I have, and you have obviously seen, very, very privileged people born into very, very wealthy families, given every kind of benefit whatsoever, having even a great intellect themselves, but they become horrible individuals. They believe life owes them. They become victims in life. So no matter how much nature gifted them or nurture gifted them, they're very, very young souls, and they become, terrible people to be around. You can see other people who come into kind of very dysfunctional families, perhaps even into a crippled body, maybe even mentally retarded, but their soul is singing, through that. And so they do great things for the world because they're beacons of love, that they radiate this love out to everybody. And so there's this difference between what I would call an old soul and a young soul. It has nothing got to do with time. It has everything got to do with the kind of ways in which people have utilized their incarnational experiences to grow in love or to grow in a kind of self-service. Now, part of our equipment is the emotions with which we're born. And I believe that every little baby is basically just born with two emotions, the ability to feel fear and the ability to feel love. Now, when fear is inner directed, it becomes anxiety and depression. When fear is outer directed, it becomes anger and even rage. When love is inner directed, it becomes self-esteem. And when love is outer directed, it becomes compassion. And then these four pieces, they combine and permute, and they create all of the other virtues and vices. And so basically, to understand any virtue or to understand any vice, you need to become an archaeologist of the psyche and dig right down and find out, what am I afraid of and how much do I love? We come in as well equipped. Part of the tool bag is we come in bearing two kinds of gifts. The first kind of gifts are our talents. And we're given these talents in order to serve the world, not to hoard them or not to use them to inflate our egos. We're like a mailman with a bunch of letters in his bag. Even if he owns the bag, he does not own the envelopes that are in the bag. They belong to the people whose names are on the envelopes. So every single talent you have, whether it's you're a great basketball player, or a mathematician or a singer or whatever it is, you've been given those in order to serve the world. You're entitled to make a living from them, but you're not entitled to make a killing from them. They do not belong to you. And the second kind of gift we come in with are our problems. Every one of us, picks out one or two or three issues we want to work on in an incarnation, and they're our problems. But they are our gift to ourselves, because they are the guarantee that we could stretch into virtue if we utilize them. Unfortunately, most of us, we hoard our talents, which are meant to be given to other people, and then we project our problems onto others, blame them for our own stuff, the stuff that we came to work on within ourselves. So they're the kinds of gifts that we come with. So the individual mission then, as I say, means working on all forms of love. Love, every virtue is love in a different guise. So sometimes it comes, as courage, sometimes compassion, sometimes trust, sometimes resilience, sometimes forgiveness. All of these basically are just ways in which love articulates itself in different circumstances. And the individual mission then is to radiate out that kind of love and to overcome all forms of fear, to overcome anger or anxiety or unforgiveness. And the realization that the hand you were born with is the hand that you pre-planned in the bardo before you incarnated. And that is the real meaning of karma. People think that karma is a punitive mechanism whereby I'm being punished in this incarnation for mistakes I made in a previous incarnation. That is not what it's about. Karma is the fact that before you came in, with all of your mentors and divine counsel, you chose life circumstances that would afford you the maximum opportunity to grow. And so you planned a hand before you came in. Karma means you woke up and that's the hand you have. Karma is a blessing that you realize, wow, here's what I planned and here's how I'm starting off life. But of course, most of us don't see it like that. Now, destiny is what happens when you play the cards that you were born with and you play them well, because you realize that some sense you chose these to grow, and then that becomes your destiny. Fate is very different. Fate is where you play them badly. You curse your luck for being born with the problems you have. And instead of growing in love, you grow in anger and hate and depression and anxiety. So then you wind up with the fate instead of with your destiny. And finally, I would say that the global mission, as well as the individual one, is that yin and yang for me represent the penultimate stage before full integration. That on our way back to God, as we work our way back up from identification with the physical body, to the etheric body, to the astral body, to the mental body, to the psychic body, up to the soul body. Now the penultimate stage is we have these yin and yang, abilities, and we have to play those when it is appropriate. Sometimes yin energy is more important. Sometimes yang energy is more important. I give the example, you come across a car accident in which a car is upside down and there's a baby trapped underneath. Yeah, and you're like a 111-pound woman, and you pick up the car and you take it off the child. You're kind of demonstrating the ultimate yang energy. But when you take the child up, you press the child to your bosom in loving, tender embrace, and now you're going into the yin part of yourself. So it becomes very, very important then when to kind of utilize the yin energy and when the yang energy. And then finally, both of these dissolve. This is the penultimate stage before there is full integration. And it becomes important for us to realize that yin and yang are not just a line drawn between females and males, or between the good guys and the bad guys. They come through all of us, and they're a gift for all of us. There is an appropriate time for being yin, and there is an appropriate time for being yang. So in your journey back home, bon voyage.